Chauhan. I'm a Distinguished Faculty Fellow for Research in the Office for the Advancement of Research. I apologize, Dr. Carpi is here, and he was running a little late, so I was going to do the introductions. Anthony, should I keep going? Okay. So it is with great pleasure to welcome you to today's book talk with Professor Helen Kapstein of the English Department at John Jay. Each year, the Office of Advancement for Research proudly sponsors events and highlights books from across the college celebrating the remarkable scholarship of our faculty. And we're always excited to learn about the exciting and innovative work that's happening all across the college that our colleagues are doing. We receive several applications, we review them through a competitive process, and then the Research Advisory Council at OAR selects the books that will be featured in our book series. And we were very proud to select Dr. Kapstein's book, Petroforms, Oil and the Shaping of Nigerian Aesthetics, published by West Virginia University for this special spotlight. Helen's book brings a nuanced perspective to how oil transforms artistic and cultural forms in Nigeria, grounding its argument in specific examples from literature, film, sculpture, and drama. It not only advances the field of petrocriticism, but also exemplifies how rigorous scholarship can illuminate pressing societal and environmental issues. Helen's work is a model of intellectual curiosity, creativity, and impact, qualities that inspire all of us at John Jay to continue to work and do our research. Joining her in today's conversation as a discussant is Associate Professor Ben Stanley from the University of Delaware. Ben co-founded the Center for Environmental Humanities, and their work explores globalization, empire, and environmental precarity. Their first book, Precarious Eating, Narrating Environmental Harm in the Global South, highlights the intersection of food, hunger, and environmental justice in South Africa and India. Ooh, now I want to read that book too. Ben's insights will enrich our discussion and help situate Helen's work within a broader global and interdisciplinary context. To the faculty that are present here, I want to encourage you to use this event as inspiration to write and publish and share your work with us, as well as nominate other scholars for the book series. And we do internal scholars as well as external scholars, so you can nominate both. This is the second book event we're hosting this semester, and we're excited to share that our next event will be on November 6th, featuring Dr. Gloria Brown Marshall. She'll be discussing her latest book, very timely, A Protest History of the United States, which explores 500 years of protest and resistance in U.S. history. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Helen Kapstein and Associate Professor Ben Stanley. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon, and thank you to OAR for your generous sponsorship of today's event. So I'm Ben Stanley, and it's a real privilege for me to be here visiting with y'all at John Jay today to be able to introduce and to converse with my friend and colleague, Professor Helen Kapstein, about this new book, Petroforms. We actually met, Helen and I, through this manuscript, as we are both scholars who are interested in the field of energy humanities, which is a branch of kind of the broader umbrella of environmental humanities. The energy humanities are interested in demystifying the relationships that we have with energy and inviting us to critically interrogate what assumptions are baked into our society about how we use energy, how this shapes the way that our society functions, and how those assumptions come under different kinds of pressure as we recognize ongoing climate catastrophe and other contributions to environmental disturbance that our current energy regimes create. So Petroforms is a really exciting new addition to this field of energy humanities, and more specifically to petrocriticism is the term that I think you prefer in the book. It takes up this question of how we relate to energy, and particularly to oil, with a focus on aesthetic forms emanating from one of the world's most notoriously polluted oil extraction zones, which is the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. Responding to the sense that oil encounters are difficult to capture in literature, Petroforms demonstrates how literary, filmic, sculptural, and also pop cultural forms from Nigeria will stretch and will change in order to be able to represent oil. And it does that in a way, I will say, that is very readable, very succinct, and engaging throughout. This is the rare example of a scholarly book that I read from cover to cover, and I enjoyed every page, and so I encourage y'all to do that the same. As to the author herself, Helen Kapstein is a professor in the English department here at John Jay. She earned her PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University. She is a postcolonial scholar whose areas of interest include cultural and media studies, tourism and museum studies, and eco and petrocriticism. Her first book was Postcolonial Nations, Islands, and Tourism, Reading Real and Imagined Spaces, which was published in 2017 by Rowman and Littlefield International. And at some point, maybe we'll get to hear how you got from islands to
myself,
oil.
yeah.
Petroforms is her second monograph, and it's very exciting that we have today the hard copies because the pub date is actually November of 2025, so we're happy that they're here. In addition to these two books, Helen has written a number of articles which have appeared in ISLE, in Postcolonial Text, and in Safundi, the Journal of South African and American Studies, among other venues. She's also done quite a bit of public-facing writing, including pieces in Ms. Magazine, Hyperallergic, and The Conversation. And she's a past president of the Cultural Studies Association. So for today's run of show, after this introduction, I'm going to just turn things over to Professor Kapstein for some remarks about the book. Then she and I are going to have a little bit of conversation about it, and then we will open things up for audience Q&A towards the end of the event. All right, so please join me in welcoming Professor Helen Kapstein.
Thank you all so much for being here. This is really exciting. I see former students, I see current students, I see my beloved family and my colleagues and friends. I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you very much to the Office for the Advancement of Research here for sponsoring this talk and for setting all of this up. Dan Stageman has been incredible. Without Remy Bahati, this event could not have happened. And also, I don't think that I could function at John Jay without Tahir Fazal, who helps me with everything to do with funding of anything. So thank you to all of them as well. There are also many more thank yous in the introduction and acknowledgments of my book, so look for your names there. So as Ben was saying, we met through the book. Ben was asked to be a blind reader for the book. And so I know that there are people, part of what I wanted to do today was to contextualize not just petrocriticism and the book Petroforms, but sort of the kind of scholarship we do in general. And so there are, early career scholars and students in the room. And one of the things that happens in academic scholarship is that we're asked to review each other's work and peer review it and give feedback. And because Ben conveniently liked the book, they were able to reveal themselves with their full name and come out of the shadows. And so we then connected and have since done a number of collaborative things together. Ben spoke at one of my classes last semester. They're here today. I'm going to go to the University of Delaware in a couple of weeks and run a grad class there. And so it's a really great example of how scholarship can forge these sorts of relationships and alliances and collaborative efforts. And it doesn't have to be something that you do lonely and alone. You can do it in community, which means a lot to me. So I can't thank you enough for being here today. So I wanted to start pretty slow. I wanted to really give us a sense of like where and when and what we're doing here. Let's see if this works. This will be the first big question. Yeah. So Ben started to talk a little bit about the terms petrocriticism and the energy humanities, right? So these are fields that have come out of postcolonial studies and environmental studies, eco-criticism in the last decade or so, really. They're really new fields. They're sort of emerging fields. And so they're really plastic, so to speak, and people are really playing around with them. And the energy humanities asks where energy and culture meet, and what humanities studies has to contribute to thinking about all of the things that come with energy, ranging from environmental crises to infrastructure to planning choices to our automobility, and et cetera. This is a quotation from somebody who actually went to undergraduate school with me and also ended up in the field, so I guess those professors had a big impact on us back in the day. This is a quote from Dominic Boyer's book, No More Fossils, which is, I think, still freely available online, should anybody want to take a closer look at it. It's a little actually hard for me to see, but I think it reads, plasticity alongside automobility remains a definitive aspect of petropower. It's also what makes petroculture so difficult to resist. One is no longer only resisting a fossil fuel, but instead a fundamental aspect of one's material environment. 60% of fibers circulating in the global economy are now synthetic fibers derived from oil. Very little of modern life exists outside of entanglement with petroleum's many forms. So just for like a quick moment of audience participation, what do you see around you? What are you wearing? What are you touching that you think might derive from petroleum and oil products? Mark's raising his phone. Yep. Yep, your phone for sure. Yep.
Toss my clothes at you.
Yeah, everything he's wearing. We're going to keep our clothes on for the duration of this event. Yep, the pen you're writing with, the glasses you're wearing, maybe the seats you're sitting on, right? Yep, I see sort of plasticky seats, yeah, or at least the feet on the bottoms of the chairs at the very least, right? So this is also from Boyer's book, and I'm not going to try to read it, but it is a partial list of the hundreds of thousands of things that we commonly use in our everyday lives that are petroleum byproducts, that have been turned into something else, into a plastic material or some related petroleum item, commodity. And you can see words up there like paintbrushes, detergents, pillows, golf balls, toothpaste, anesthetics, artificial turf, and artificial limbs, among others. I'm just sort of randomly picking what I can see in the very bright sun. So this is to illustrate just how embedded we are in what we call our petromodernity. It is everywhere, it is all around us, and it's often unremarked, right? We take for granted the fact that we use all of these things on a daily basis without ever thinking about where they derive from. And we have the luxury of thinking that way because, for the most part, most of us in this room are not immediately physically adjacent to what it takes to get the cortisone, deodorant, footballs, putty and dyes, and pantyhose into our houses and workplaces, right? That's not true of the people who live in the Niger Delta and other places that are in immediate danger in current existing harm from the processes that help to get the petrol and petroleum out of the ground onto the tanker across the ocean and into not just our gas stations, right? Because you think of the petrol pump self-evidently, but you don't think of these things self-evidently, right? So in the world of energy humanities and petrocriticism, we do a lot of the thinking started in Western scholarship, and a lot of the thinking started with ideas about what has been called the energy unconscious, which is that we're allowed to have an energy unconsciousness about these things because we are privileged to do so, right? But that energy unconsciousness doesn't extend to people who can't afford who simply can't turn a blind eye to it because it's everywhere and all around them. I wanted to talk a little bit about what that looks like. Maybe I'll skip to there and then I'll circle back. Let's see what the next... So I have a series of images here from Ed Kashi's gorgeous set of photos and it's a little hard to see, but this is a picture of a Niger delta. And it is just strewn with rubbish, right? And much of the rubbish in this picture is plastic, right? So it's not only true that the people in Nigeria's Niger Delta live in and among the extraction processes and everything else of petroleum, but also that the full circle violence of petroleum extraction comes back around. Thanks. That's so much better. Thank you so much. Right, comes back around so that they are also then the consumers and recipients of the waste products, right? In the age-old tradition of how colonial processes like these always work, right? You extract the resource, then you create a marketplace to sell the resource back to. And there's a lot of discussion in our academic circles about what it means to waste something, right? This is a wasted landscape. This is a landscape full of waste. This is a landscape that has, is full of waste products, right? So that's something interesting to think about as well. More immediately, perhaps even than the petro byproducts, is the actual just living with the oil, right, in the Niger Delta. So this is, again, the next few photos are all from the Ed Kashi series. So you can see oiled bodies from workers, or possibly not even workers, because a lot of the local people in the Delta are not actually employed in the oil industry, but they live alongside it. So this might be people who have, done all sorts of things. They might have, tried to go fishing in a swamp that no longer, is fresh enough to fish in. They might have extracted oil from a pipeline. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, which they can't afford to pay for unless they break into the pipeline, right? So here's a woman drying out her produce over an open gas flare. One of the kinds of pollution that happens in these environments is not just the pollution of the soil and the water, but there's light pollution as well, so that people live with the gas flares all day, every day, so that it's always bright. There's a gas flare. This is people rolling an oil barrel up the hill. We'll talk more about barrels in a little while too. And so we're starting to think here about the containment or the non-containment of oil, right? Here's oil where it's sort of supposed to be. It's in a barrel. It's being pushed by people who are presumably taking it somewhere productive to sell or whatever, right? But we've also seen in the earlier photos, like in the men covered with the oil where it's not supposed to be, right? It's not supposed to be staining bodies and ruining rivers and stuff. And so a lot of what I was interested in with Petroforms was the question of containment, right? Where does oil escape the places it's supposed to be, and where does that show up in the aesthetic products that I talk about in the book? Where does it end up kind of seeping into the conversation, and therefore not just escaping physically where big oil, which is what we call the conglomerates, want it to be so that they can make a commodity out of it, but also, where does it show up in the literature and the art and all of those things, right? Where does it sort of appear where it's no longer so controllable and containable? There's men backing off from a flare. And this is one of my favorite photos in this series. Can you see what's on her umbrella? Yeah, it's the Shell oil symbol. So this is a woman walking through the pipelines that run through her backyard, her neighborhood, her community. There's a story I talk about in the book where the people declare that they are the pipeline people. So she's one of those people. But of course she's, using what's basically a petro product and, advertising Shell oil while having to, traverse the landscape that Shell oil has ruined for her. All right. So I talked a little bit about the question of containment. I'm going to just go back to an earlier slide. This is a wonderful photo of something called the pitch drop experiment. which was conducted, I think it's Wales, University of Wales. It started in like the 1920s, and it's an experiment that's ongoing. This is bitumen. Bitumen is a petroleum, it's not a byproduct, it's one of the forms that petroleum can take. And nobody knew whether bitumen was what kind of matter it was, what the state of matter it was. Was it solid or was it something else? And so the pitch drop experiment is this bitumen in a vial. And once every decade or so, it drops. And it turns out that it is actually viscose. Yeah, it has viscosity like glass does, right? You think of glass as solid, but actually it's a kind of solidy, liquidy thing. And so is bitumen. And I wanted to include this because it's just such a great emblem of the problem that oil presents, right? What is it? It is the thing that we think about. We talk about mineral fuel, fossil fuels as minerals, but they're not. They're organic. They come from fossils. That's the name, right? So it's organic matter. And yet we talk about it differently. It takes on all of these forms. It's solid, it's liquid, it's bitumen, it's petroleum, it's crude. It's all of these things all at the same time. It serves all of any equivalent number of purposes in the industry, in the oil industry. And this is a great example of the problem of containment of it and the description of it, and a reason why it tends to take on all of these metaphorical terms. People talk about oil as blood and oil gushing out as other bodily emissions and all sorts of ways that sort of evade the thing itself, because the thing itself is hard to pin down, it's hard to contain, it's hard to name and identify. I also wanted to include it because somebody who's been huge for us and for the other post-colonialists in the room is the scholar Rob Nixon, who was one of my grad school mentors, and his book, Slow Violence, is a foundational text for the field in which he talks about basically the contrast between the spectacular violence of something like a pipeline explosion, right, versus the slow violence of the slow seeping of oil into your tributaries and your rivers and that sort of thing. And I like this because it's almost as though that's what's happening here. Hi, everybody. Come on in. You haven't missed too much. Great. I'm just going to give it a second while people find a seat, because we suddenly have twice the people we had. Great, there's some seats up front if you'd like to sit. Yeah, so I was just saying that there's a difference between spectacular and slow violence, and oil is violent in both of those ways. Oil is violent to people spectacularly. Some pipeline will explode and people will be terribly injured or killed. And also, it's this ongoing environmental disaster over which there are all sorts of lawsuits and other contestations. And this moment of when the pitch drops is sort of that moment of when, for me, when the slow violence turns spectacular, because you can still tune in a live YouTube stream of this and wait for the pitch to drop next. The last time it dropped was last year, so don't wait, don't hold your breath. But every so often, irregularly, it does drop in the same way that every so often there's this spectacular moment of violence that captures all of our international attention, and then we forget because it's really boring to watch the slow violence that petroleum produces. Okay, what's next? Okay, so that's a little bit about both the content and the form, right? This is a book called Petroforms. It's about that tension between form and content. What is the thing? How do you contain it? What happens when the thing becomes uncontainable? And so I was really interested in these art forms, and I picked a whole bunch of them. We'll talk about that in a second, that all had to manage dealing with oil, because these are Nigerian art products. They wanted to engage with oil, but how were they to do that when oil itself has proven, as we've just described, to be so resistant, right? It's so difficult. So why Nigeria is the last question. I think that the Ed Kashi slides speak for themselves, right? Because so much petrocriticism is thought about, where's the big American oil novel, and how do what have Americans? Are Americans going to wake up from their oil unconsciousness and all of those things, right? I wanted to make sure that there was attention paid to the places that are actually the sites of extraction, and where the engagement with oil is direct and the impact is immediate. So, oops, it's hard to have the button and the mic and the paper. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good setup. Does that feel satisfactory as a setup?
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm so excited to talk with you more about the book. So I do have some questions for you. In recent years, I think a lot of us, both inside the academy and also outside the academy, have been trying to come to terms with this issue of just how profoundly our society is shaped by our encounter with petroleum and with other fossil fuels as well. Within our field, within the humanities and also the social sciences, this has led to this proliferation of terms that start with that prefix petro, right? So we'll hear petromodernity, we'll hear petroculture, we'll hear petromagic realism is one of my favorites, scholar Jennifer Wenzel's term. Your book is titled Petroforms, so I have kind of a two-part question for you. First part, what do you mean by petroforms, right? Could you tell us a little bit what you mean by that term? And then second part, the book is organized in this really interesting way by many different words that start with that prefix petro. So you have chapters on petrofeminism, on petro art, on petro horror, on petro cinema, on petrodrama, and on petrofiction. So I wondered if you could also talk a little bit about how that chapter structure arose for you and what it allowed you to do. Why did it feel important to name and to differentiate those different kinds of petroforms? And how does something like petro art or petrodrama differ from, say, petro horror and the kind of work that they do?
Good question. So the petro prefix can apply to almost anything, right? You're wearing petro glasses on your head, right? You've got petro soles on the bottoms of your shoes. To apply it to these specific aesthetic forms is to ask how that the sense of the art form that we traditionally have takes on the petro prefix and is remade by it, right? So in one sense, there's a commonality, and I'm saying that all of these art forms do something similar, right? They all have to both react to dealing with petroleum, but then they also have the capacity to remake that relationship, to resist the petroleum, to talk back to big oil, to do something like that, right? It's not just a reactive, a one-stage reactive equation, right? On the other hand, if you look at the title page of the book, or the chapter layout, you'll notice that not all of those forms are equivalent, right? So I'm sort of cheating, but I'm cheating with an eye towards the bigger claim. It is not true that petro art sounds the same as petro horror, or that petrodrama sounds the same as petrofeminism, right? Some of those sound more recognizably like forms than others. Some of them sound a little bit more like genre, say, right? And it turns out it's really, really tricky to extricate form from genre, for one thing, but also that in sort of mixing and matching the way I've labeled these things, I have called attention in naming them to the ways in which the forms are remade, right? So the petrofeminism chapter is a chapter about romance novels. The form in that chapter is the romance novel. The argument is that, so there's two veins of how people have thought about petrofeminism. One is that women who are confronted with petroleum in some way are the most vulnerable to all of its violences. They're the most likely to be trying to sabotage the pipeline to get oil to run the stove at home, right? They're the most likely to be injured in some way, health-wise, by all of the terrible things that living in an environment like the one that we saw pictures of does to you. In my version of the chapter, in my version of petrofeminism, in that chapter, I say yes, and, right, in an improv kind of way, yes, and that's true, but also those things allow for the occasions of solidarity and coming together among women that might not otherwise happen, right? There are ways in which, in the romance novels, we can see women coming together around having to grapple with oil that might not otherwise produce themselves, right? Yeah. So art is not equivalent to horror, but because the categories are fuzzy, that calls attention to my claim that petro categories are inherently fuzzy, that they're constantly, they start with a container that we're familiar with, the idea of sculpture, and then oil does something to it. The engagement with oil does something to that familiar form that changes it, right? Yeah. So I actually wanted to just show a comparison, if you're okay with pausing your question. Absolutely. So I have a chapter on petro art, and the art in the chapter is almost entirely the work of Sakari Douglas Camp, who was one of the incredibly generous people to give me her time for this project. We had an extensive conversation via Zoom and other ways about her work. So thank you to her for doing that for me. This is a sculpture called All That Glitters, and you can see that there's this figure made of steel astride a split in half oil barrel, right? And she's kind of triumphant. She's got her arms crossed, and she's sort of mid-dance and mid-air, suspended above this oil barrel, which has been split in half and is thus no longer capable of doing what it was intended to do when it was just an oil barrel, right? So she's reimagining what that looks like. And so her sculptures do something where they kind of freeze these moments of oil engagement and let us sort of pause and see something else in these objects and materials and products. This is her sculpture called Wrestling Oil Shell BP, where there are these two wrestling figures astride what looks like an oil barrel. It's painted with the Shell symbol and the BP symbol, and then you can see at the bottom there's this kind of seepage. And I actually just wanted to read a page or so from the book so that you could hear a little bit of the book here about what I said about these images. I guess I need to hold the mic and read, right? Okay. Let's see. Douglas Camp retains an ironically playful stance about the place of petroleum in our world. The descriptive notes for Green Leaf Barrel and All That Glitters both emphasize their humor and optimism. The two pieces bear a family resemblance. They feature an oil barrel split in half with a woman also made of metal on top. In Green Leaf Barrel, she's kneeling to cultivate the perspex plant growing out of the barrel. In All That Glitters, she's suspended above the sliced barrel, quote, showing off being invincible, is what Douglas said about it. Together, they convey a conquering spirit, able to create nature out of the capitalist artifact and to ride astride it. Though, of course, among the ironies here is the fact that not only is this nature artificial, but that perspex, a branded form of plexiglass, is itself a petroleum product. Steel, too, is a problematic medium, a reality Douglas Camp acknowledges, calling it in an interview with Voice magazine a very polluting material, and remarking that, quote, the pieces that I've made about the situation in the Niger Delta have tried to highlight action and positivity, but are also made from steel and part of the destruction and deterioration of our environment. On her About the Artist page, On her About the Artist page, page. Douglas Camp shares the genesis of her use of oil barrels and her awareness of the utter ubiquity of oil. Living in London and being gifted oil barrels by her local garage introduced this material to her work. This made Sakari think of her environment, I'm turning the page with one hand, and the products that are derived from oil petroleum. Everything seems to have an element of this product. For example, on my desk, my keyboard, pen, sellotape, headphones, my jumper, and the concoction which has created my lipstick. Douglas Camp's figures frequently wear bright lipstick themselves, the color popping against their metallic skins. In her sculptures, open blue lips and orange lips on the screen here, disembodied hands paint sets of disembodied lips, except the contents of the lipstick tube in each is a correspondingly colored toy car. The substitution makes explicit how the packaging of oil as cosmetics in your headphones, in your clothes, is a form of containment and concealment, a sly operation that inserts oil into everything. Our ready association of automobiles with oil through gas stations, oil changes, and rubber tires helps to make visible the less obvious links between petroleum and its seemingly endless product list. And I love a moment like this. I love finding a moment where there's an accidental typo or something that says so much, right? Really, it should be everything, but here it's everything, right? Mm-hmm. And so that really draws attention to how it's every little thing. Which is just a very long way of answering your question, and to say that something like this sculpture is really different from, say, like the drama chapter, where I talk about a play that would be unstageable because it directs you, the stage directions direct you to go back to the beginning and start again at the end, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't actually perform the play as written. And so it's a great example of how the form doesn't work, and the only way that you can experience the petro form of it at all is as a script, not as a performance piece.
Yeah. Something that has come up already a lot in your remarks today, and that I think is really important to the field of petrocriticism, is this kind of question of the disparity of how oil and its forms are experienced in global south spaces versus global north spaces. But something that for me is really interesting about petroforms is that you also complicate that binary for us, right? That's not just a dichotomy. So you are considering what we might think of as protest art and literature about the Niger Delta and about all the harm wrought there by the extraction of oil. But you do also talk about another side of oil in Nigerian culture, and I hear that a little bit too in some of the complex ways that you're talking about those sculptures. So this idea that petroleum is omnipresent and that there is a kind of romance of petro-modernity experienced especially by more privileged Nigerian subjects in Lagos and beyond. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about that aspect, kind of that idea of a romance or being drawn towards petroleum, and how you're thinking about that in Nigeria's context.
Yeah, thanks. So I mentioned petrofeminism earlier and the romance novels, and so that's one aspect of it, right? Mm-hmm. That there was, it's fun stuff to write about, right? There are these moments where people are canoodling in the backs of cars, and I got to write about, sort of punning on autoeroticism and, all of, I love a good pun, right? But then also there's the kind of, I think what you're referring to is the more direct, enthusiastic petromodernity, right? Yeah. Of people embracing oil and what it has to offer, and the idea of getting rich off of it, right? There's, a lot of people have gotten really, really rich off of Nigerian oil, right? And none of those people are the local Niger Delta residents, but some of them are Nigerians, right? And so, again, Nixon talks extensively about this sort of, corporate state relationship, and he uses the word romance when he does, right? Mm-hmm. So he talks about that sort of sinister romance between the state that is making money off of its impoverished population, right? And the corporations that fund the state and, you know, that circle of life. Yeah, so if you read the book, there's stuff on, scams that have been perpetrated by people pretending to be oil workers and, you know, all sorts of things that lean into the idea that there's maybe something to be gained. And then the book ends with a section on the famous artist, activist, writer, Ken Saro-Wiwa's sitcom and called Bossie and Company. And in Bossie and Company, Bossie is this character who is he's always got a scheme. He's always trying to make it. He's always trying to make it rich. He's got a get-rich scheme for everything, but it never materializes, right? And so there's always this sort of grasping quality to to the romance of it.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to pick up on that note about the corporation, and I think this question will take us there. You mentioned already how form factors into the argument. Something that really engaged me about the book was how the definition of form itself kind of stretches and changes in your analysis throughout. So on the one hand, you're talking about what the literary scholars in the room, what we might traditionally think of as literary forms, right? Things like a romance novel, right? Or you're talking about forms like sculpture, right? But you also are talking about the strange forms that information dissemination on the part of corporations like Shell can take. So you talk at one point about their various different company websites. You talk about this specific PDF published in 2014 that functions as part of Shell's strategy of, quote, a dissembling shell game of quickly moving parts. That's me quoting you from the book on page 23. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you think about form beyond what we traditionally categorize as literary or artistic forms? What resonated for you in being able to also think about the PDF or the website as a form alongside the documentary film or the short story?
Yeah, right. I love those bits, and I want to do more of that kind of thing. I wish I'd done a little bit more of it in this book. I'm definitely doing more of it in the next book. And I'm going to read a couple of passages to illustrate some of that, but just to answer the question first. Big Oil has an emergency on its hands, right? It is culpable for incredible death and devastation. And it needs to contain that crisis, right, while continuing to sell us petroproducts. So the state of emergency that it is always under shows up in these, in its own narrative forms by way of the confusions and the lies and the dissembling and everything else that those forms do to try to distract us and confuse us about what's really happening, right? So if the question of petroforms is partly a question of what is emergent, what is emerging into the next version of the form, right? The state of becoming, then the emergent connects to the emergency, right? Because the emergency is showing up in these other kinds of emergent new forms, which also can't contain the crisis, right? And then to swing back to an earlier question that you sort of hinted at about how did I get from islands to petroleum, it's really, looking back, it really is about form, right? Because the island book was an argument that the post-colonial nation figures itself out in the island space, but that island shape is always shifting and eroding and, you know, bleeding into other spaces, liminal and watery, right? And so I guess I've always been interested in what it means to hold your shape or not, right? Yeah. So just to read a little bit about the Shell oil stuff. I don't think you're going to be able to see this very well, but that's the PDF that Ben was just referring to. And I'm going to read a couple of different bits that kind of connect to this, if that's okay with everybody. Could somebody tell me how we're doing on time?
Let's do this, and then maybe we'll go to Q&A afterwards.
Okay, great. Let's see. Big Oil regularly accuses residents of the oil-rich Niger Delta region of acts of sabotage, including illegal bunkering or siphoning oil for use or sale, and vandalizing pipelines and facilities. The language multinational corporations use to describe this behavior sets up a narrative of criminality. They talk about the theft of oil, of a black market, implicitly linking illegality, race, and the color of oil, and both the companies and the press frame the locals in pejorative terms. Shell's website alleges, quote, criminal activities including sabotage, oil theft, and illegal refining are causing huge environmental damage in the Niger Delta. From 2008 to 2012, these activities accounted for around 76% of the oil that escaped from Shell Petroleum Development Company facilities. In one of the stories I read in this chapter, a character indicts this habit of calling young men thugs and reminds us who the true culprits are. Quote, young men are kidnapping expatriate employees and demanding ransoms. They're locked up. We call them thugs. Young girls are turning to prostitution to service expatriate employees. They're locked up too. We shun them. We say they bring AIDS. Meanwhile, the oil companies spill oil on our land, leak oil into our rivers. They won't clean up their mess. All they do is pay small fines if they pay it at all. The meanwhile in the middle of that diatribe sutures together independent clauses that might not otherwise be connected, things said and done to the community versus the things that oil companies do. It reveals a consequential causal relationship between these ideas and seems carefully chosen as a word about time to comment on the temporal uncoupling of these experiences in the normative narrative, in which they appear to occupy concurrent but separate time zones. In reality, though, negligence and neglect on the part of the companies has so drastically impacted the area that its environmental degradation has been called ecocide. The stories act as a corrective to that narrative, one that commands enormous authority since it's backed by enormous assets. They reframe the actions of impoverished Nigerian citizens as tactical maneuvers by people wielding the only weapon that they have, using the tools of the multinationals, using the tools of exploitation against their exploiters. They expose the absurdity of the multinationals blaming the people for their own poor behavior and the irony of a mindset that frames those people as criminals stealing back their own oil, which gets us to the PDF, which I say a little bit about here. And I'm actually going to read a chunk of the PDF because it's so mind-boggling in its confusion as text. So I'm talking here a few pages later. Oh, thanks so much, Remy. Thank you. Thanks, Remy. I've been talking here in the middle of this chapter later on about siphoning or bunkering fuel. So I say the everyday practice of siphoning or bunkering denotes a different kind of reappropriation. Bunkering as a term has suggestive associations. Traditionally, on board ship, you fill bunkers with oil for your own consumption. Here, this becomes taking oil for yourself. And it can also mean being placed in a position difficult to extricate oneself from. Read one way, Nigerian locals are clearly bunkered by their circumstances, but read in reverse, the oil companies find themselves at the mercy of bunkering, which we see in their high anxiety about loss of revenue to the practice, manifested in ever-escalating accusations. This Shell oil theft PDF contends that, quote, crude oil theft, sabotage, and illegal refining are the main source of pollution in the Niger Delta today. In 2013, the Nigerian government estimated crude oil theft and associated deferred production at over 300,000 barrels of oil per day. Intentional third-party interference with pipelines and other infrastructure was responsible for about 75% of all oil spill incidents and 92% of all oil volume spilled from facilities operated by the Shell Petroleum Development Company over the last 5 years. And it goes on. It's actually a bit too long for me to read all of it. So it goes on to say, on average, around 32,000 barrels of oil per day were stolen from the pipelines and other facilities, and this equates to several $1 billion in revenue losses for the Nigerian government and the joint venture. So then what I say about that is that there's a very keen sense in this document of the leaking of value that shows up in both the figures and in the diction. The word theft shows up on that page 5 times alone, right, accusing the locals of thieving their own resource. One of my students, when I taught this, pointed out that the math doesn't math either. That there's, if you add up the, I think it's the 92% with the 15%, 93% from theft, and then another 15% from what they're calling operational spills, you end up with 107%, right? So it's not even an attempt to make sense of it, right? It's just an attempt to, you know, sort of to dissemble about it, right? Yeah. Did I answer the question?
You absolutely did, yeah. And I think that's a great moment for us to pause our conversation. I certainly have more questions, but I think we should open it up to the audience and see what questions other folks might have for Professor Kapstein.
Adam? I don't know if they want you to use the mics at the side for picking up on the recording, or if that matters. Thanks.
So I think we could identify a modernity that starts before petromodernity, right?
Yes.
Like, so like maybe it's a coal-driven right? Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious, when does petromodernity start? Because it's after coal modernity, and like, can you tease out a difference between those two kinds of modernity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the energy humanities is really interested in different energy regimes and eras, right? And the sort of inceptual text for the field was by Patricia Yeager, where she writes about the age of coal, wood, and oil. I can't remember the oil, wood, and anyway. And so you can I taught, for instance, Tempest as a text through the idea of the age of firewood last semester, right? Mm-hmm. So you can take up this same sort of theorization and apply it to all of the eras. But I think that one of the things that's really worth being cautious about is not to assume that they're not coterminous, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not, while I take your point, it's not actually true that we are out of the age of coal, right? Because not only are there plenty of people who use coal in their daily lives, but coal makes electricity, right? And we want to move into like electric cars and stuff, right? So all of these eras are simultaneous, and it's the same kind of problematic that you end up with when you imagine that somebody, you know, far away is also far behind. And in fact, we all occupy the same petromodernity that also overlays with other kinds of modernities that have other kinds of energy regimes embedded in them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you want to add to that, Ben?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I'll hold my tongue because I really want to, yeah.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Zisa Aziza. I'm not a student here. My question essentially is, do you think there's a parallel between Nigeria's struggle to have their environment not destroyed for the imperial profit of petroleum? Does it parallel with the U.S. and sort of like fracking, our water being very, very, you know, we went from like copper pipes to plastic, you know, the correlation between just neurodegenerative issues in our society, like it feels like a very parallel struggle where we as the people who inhabit our communities do not have sort of like the right to sort of protect our bodies. Because I don't see the difference.
No.
I don't see the difference.
I don't think there is one. Yeah. Great question. Thank you so much. No, I mean, the bodily and environmental harms are universal and not at all contained to specific parts of the world, right? And they often correspond to energy regime changes. So you have 3 Mile Island and nuclear meltdown, and you have water crises and you name it, right? Right? And you're pointing out the bodily harms that come with these catastrophes, right? But again, it's not always the headline-grabbing, spectacular violence that matters the most. It's the slow seepages, right? That I think that art forms can sometimes draw our attention to, where the headlines lose interest or whatever, right? Yeah. Go on, you have a follow-up.
So my worry about the way we alchemize or repurpose trauma into art is that it becomes a sedative. And I see it, I've been wandering around all of the Eventbrite public sort of academic events. Just yesterday I was at NYU, and a woman essentially was called like between, something about like the river that flows both ways. And she had taken art that was from like colonial times, and then she put it on like Chinaware.
Yeah.
And like,
Right. And now it's
then it was
now it's
food,
beautiful, right?
It was
Yeah,
food,
yeah.
and I drank like 2 bottles of Pellegrino. I was like, thank you. This is like not cheap water anymore. But then like the room felt sedated. I come to these lectures, people, y'all seem sedated, you know? So I'm like, we can talk about it, we can theorize it, we can build chapels in the sky, but we still need to have our feet on the ground.
Totally. So I'd love there to be more of what you're calling for, which is communion and connection from one node of trauma to another, right? And I also think that some of the art that I talk about is not just pretty, right? A lot of it is messy and smelly and disruptive. I'm thinking, for instance, of the I don't have a picture of it, but this sculptor made a massive, larger-than-life bus out of steel and oil cans. And it says on the side of it a slogan about the Ogoni Nine, who were the members of the Ogoni opposition to the Nigerian government, who were murdered by the governmental regime for their protest, and Ken Saro-Wiwa was one of those assassinated by his own state. And so this is a moving memorial tribute to those people who protested for their own rights. And then when she built it and tried to take it to Nigeria to tour it, it was impounded by the government, right? So art can be protest, art can be powerful and disruptive. It doesn't just have to be pretty and hold your Pellegrino water. It's better when it spills out and it's messy.
I might add just in response to your first question, I think you bring up a really important point about the kind of parallels of within the United States harming its own citizens, within Nigeria harming its own citizens. But I would offer also the idea that the US is kind of doubly guilty, because we're also buying the shell oil here, right? Because we get so much of our oil from these processes that are occurring in places like the Niger Delta. And not all of that harm comes home to roost with us, right? Yeah. Do we have more questions?
I had one, but I don't know how I can back that up.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. Hi, everybody. And I just I live in a bubble, so I'm embarrassed to say, but I do. I just recently heard a podcast of Mel Robbins with somebody that she had a guest speaker with synthetic fibers, and he was like, don't do it, everything you breathe, you know. So it was interesting to hear that being brought up. But one of you mentioned in the beginning of America being kind of like asleep. And I think you guys said like unconscious. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, how long have we actively been asleep? And is there anybody awake enough in America that is actively assisting or trying to assist those that are awake in Nigeria or in any other parts of the world that are trying to make some strides to make a dent in changing this? Because I know we are collectively technically asleep. I mean, again, I live in a bubble. But, you know, who or what organizations, if any, are actually trying to make those dents and strides, other than like scholars that are, you know, putting yourselves out there and giving us that information? Because if it wasn't for this, I would be like, you know.
Yeah.
Who do we know is doing this?
Thank you. Do you want to take that first?
I I can, yeah. I mean, you really put me in mind, actually, of, so Ken Saro-Wiwa has been mentioned already, so really important activist from the Niger Delta region, a member of the Ogoni people, and also someone who was murdered by the Nigerian government under the dictatorship of Sani Abacha for his involvement in calling attention to what was happening in the Niger Delta. So really important activist. Part of why Saro-Wiwa became so transnationally known is because it occurred to him, and this is something that Rob Nixon talks about a lot in Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, it occurred to him to frame the struggle in the Niger Delta as being an environmental justice struggle. And that's a vocabulary that resonates with us here in the US, right? Environmental justice is a term that comes out of the activism of people like Robert Bullard, who was from Warren, North Carolina, part of wrote about in Warren, North Carolina, the activism of the Black community against siting of a toxic waste disposal in their neighborhood, right? People like the Chicanx and Filipinx farm workers in California who formed the United Farm Workers Association and kind of sought to draw attention to the toxicity of pesticides that they were experiencing in their workplace, right? Those kinds of activist figures, and there are many more of them in the present, are the kinds of Americans that I think about as being awake, right, in the question that you asked, and giving a vocabulary to the kind of structures that we're seeing of people being environmentally poisoned. And Saro-Wiwa had the kind of astuteness to think about my struggle is parallel to their struggle, right? To think about the parallel and to make that connection between what's going on in the United States and what's going on in Nigeria, and in that way make his own struggle much more visible.
Right, and the previous questioner mentioned fracking, right? And it's moments like when people go to pipelines and protest fracking or whatever that draw our attention in those more spectacular, obvious ways, right? That then do wake us up, at least momentarily, right? I mean, we have a tendency to fall back asleep, right? But it's, you know, the moments when it rises to the level of public discourse that, you know, they accumulate, right? They, eventually things stick. We hope that eventually things change. But it's part of why we teach, right? I mean, I think, you know, the other answer is we're here because we now your eyes are more open, right? This is one of my brilliant students in my class this semester, right? When we get to the Nigeria unit, right, I will give you links to places that are actively campaigning.
So I have a sub-question, and I'm sorry about that. Okay. I'm so tiny. I'll do, okay. So in the beginning, there was a slide with the pitchboard, if I might be saying it wrong.
Yeah, the pitch drop.
And, you know, the
Experiment.
soft violence or the silent violence,
Yep.
and then the explosive
Oh, I like that.
violence.
Silent violence.
Realistically, going back to what I said about America being asleep and not actively being awake, do you guys think that in order for actual change to happen, there has to be an explosive change internationally, or would it change anything if it was international but soft, you know, silence?
Yeah, I mean, you're getting at this whole other barrel of worms about energy transition and our climate catastrophe, right? We are in crisis, and we are also willing to bury our heads in the sand about it. So I don't know what it will take, is the short answer.
I think also, this is maybe a depressing answer to your question, but I think also, like, this brings up that those of us who are outraged about this would like to see some kind of spectacular change to the energy regime that we live in, right? A lot of the change that is happening with energy transition is less like we're overthrowing these evil oil companies and like stopping them from doing what they've been doing, and more like those oil companies deciding that it's increasingly marketable for them to refashion themselves as energy companies and for them to get invested in alternative fuel sources so that they will economically survive and continue to profit from the energy transition, right? it's pretty obvious that their investment isn't in like making right what they've done, right, but continuing to be profitable as the energy market shifts, right?
Right, and also blaming us, right? So for instance, the carbon footprint was invented by big oil and energy companies in order to make us feel individually accountable, when really, we know that one person's actions matter very little one at a time, right? Yeah. It's only when we come together that it matters. No, don't be sorry. I think we probably have time for one more, but I don't know how, yeah?
Yeah, we've got a little time.
Yeah, do we have time for one more question? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
if you want to step up to the mic.
I'm sorry, I don't know if this question been asked already, but I was really curious, if you're the teacher of John Jay, right, how did you come up to write the book about Nigeria and what problems they face? Because when I was in my high school, my teacher also, she covers some of this, like how Nigeria is helping the United States and how all this system works. So I was just curious how you came up to gather all this information and to write a book. Because when we write something or tell about something, we also we are having our base. So we have sort of information, or it's kind of focus us. So whatever we do is something that connects to us and something that we reflect. So I was just curious, how did you come up to write about it?
I'm happy to answer it more extensively when we're chatting around the food, but I'll just briefly say that we're both post-colonial scholars, and we both actually do more work on South Africa than, although I have now an entire book about Nigeria, but this is partly because what happened for me was that the personal became political and professional. My dad is in the audience today, and he was a journalist his whole career, and we lived all over the world, and one of those places was South Africa during the apartheid regime. And it was the influence of that very charged environment that was very influential on me and then set me up for a career of studying what I had experienced. That's the short answer. Did you want to say something?
I think maybe.
Okay, I think we're probably good on timing for conclusion because it's almost 6. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. Dean Carpy, please.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate you coming out. Let me make 2 quick announcements. As was announced at the beginning, our next book talk is Thursday, November 6th at 4:30 in Heron Hall, A Protest History of the United States. Also for the faculty here, October 23rd at 1:45, we have OAR is sponsoring a boot camp on finding funding opportunities. What a great conversation this was. I really enjoyed listening and hearing more about the book. And please join us afterwards for a little reception in embarrassingly petro-wrapped food. But, sorry.
Would have been hard to avoid.
Please join me in thanking Professor Kapstein and Professor Jameson Stanley for being here. Thank you.